Today I'll be telling you about Joseph Edward Duncan III, a serial sex offender and convicted murderer, and the case that finally exposed his lifetime of crime. On February 25, 1963, Joseph Edward Duncan III was born in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Joseph had 4 brothers and sisters. Specifically, he had 3 older sisters and a younger brother. Joseph's father was in the Army, so as a child he moved around a lot, but his family settled in Tacoma, Washington when his dad retired. At the time, Joseph was about 12 years old. And despite having what from the outside looked like a normal childhood, later it would be exposed that allegedly abuse took place. Where and how this abuse took place would be written about by Joseph years later in his dark blog and horrific video footage. More on that later. Joseph's parents divorced in 1983, and soon his sisters left the house, but Joseph stayed behind to be with his mother, and his younger brother went to live with his father. While Joseph did attend Lakes High School, he did not graduate. Again, Joseph seemed like a normal young boy, but just 15 years old, he had already committed his first sex crime. And those are just the crimes that Joseph would later admit to. Unfortunately, this would be the first of many, many horrible crimes that Joseph would commit during his lifetime. Again, we want to warn our viewers that this case will be dealing with pedophilia, child rape, child sexual assault, child abduction, child murders, and many more unthinkable crimes. So please take caution as the story only gets more and more twisted. In this first recorded incident, when Joseph was only 15 years old, he is reported to have raped a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. But it would be a long journey before Joseph would face a prison sentence. When Joseph was just 16, he was arrested for stealing a car. This would be one of the many cars that he stole throughout his lifetime. One of these cars years later would be a helpful clue in a terrible case. At the time, Joseph was sentenced as a juvenile and was sent to the Jesse Dislin Boys Ranch in Tacoma. And that's where Joseph allegedly admitted to a therapist that had been assigned to his case the even darker crimes he had committed. And this is where he should have been held indefinitely and treated for his various mental health issues. Supposedly, Joseph told his therapist that he had bound and sexually assaulted 6 boys already. Keep in mind, Joseph was only 15 at that time. This should have been enough to put him in jail for life, or at the very least keep him off the streets, but that did not happen. And that wasn't even the end of Joseph's confessions. By the time Joseph turned 16, he estimated that he had raped 13 younger boys. And if only Joseph had been convicted of those crimes at the time, everything that would happen next could have been avoided. But that was not the case, unfortunately, and Joseph's reign of terror was just beginning. Just a few years later, in 1980, Joseph reportedly stole guns from his neighbor and then abducted a 14-year-old boy. Joseph then proceeded to rape this boy at gunpoint as well, which one would hope would put him in prison for life, but it did not. At this time, Joseph was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Again, with Joseph's obvious history of rape and his violence, it's crazy that he was even released, but hauntingly enough, he was let go and put on parole in 1994. This would be a tragedy for all his victims that would come in the next few years while he was out of jail. It seems everywhere that Joseph went, he left victims of rape, kidnapping, and murder. And that's not an exaggeration, and later would be confirmed through multiple court cases. But this case really does make you wonder why there are not stricter laws for repeat sexual offenders, especially child rapists and pedophiles. While on parole, Joseph moved to several different locations in and around the Seattle area. And during this time, he continued to commit unthinkable crimes, most of which he was not ever caught doing, but thank goodness in 1996 he was finally arrested again. But was it for murder and rape? Nope. This time he was arrested for And during this brief parole period is when authorities and investigators now believe that Joseph murdered Samiejo White and Carmen Cubias. Again, investigators have never fully confirmed exactly how many victims Joseph had. His laundry list of crimes and victims is beyond long and completely horrific. And not long after that, authorities now believe that Joseph kidnapped Anthony Martinez in California. Unfortunately, this case would not be tied to Joseph for many years, and Anthony's family would have to wait without answers to find any kind of justice for years. But more to come on Anthony's case a little later. In 1997, Joseph was finally arrested again for violating the terms of his parole. It's insane that Joseph's bigger crimes went unnoticed by the police, while his petty crimes continued to get him in trouble. But he would soon be released and begin another rampage of rape, murder, and destruction. In July 2000, Joseph was released from prison. This time, he moved to Fargo, North Dakota. But did Joseph finally clean up his act? Absolutely not, and his crimes would only escalate and get worse from here. In March 2005, Joseph was charged with molesting 2 boys at a playground in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. Reading this case, it doesn't make sense that Joseph was able to harm so many children and continue to walk free. Perhaps I don't understand enough about the justice system, but it's a horrible reality of this case, and it's hard not to think that if Joseph had just been convicted early, so many victims could have been saved. In April 2005, when Joseph appeared before a Becker County judge, his bail was set at $15,000. And unfortunately, a friend of Joseph's from Fargo helped him get the bail money to get out. And not long after Joseph skipped bail and effectively disappeared, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest on the charge of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. And shortly after, he stumbled upon young Shasta and Dylan's house, and that's when things would take a terrible turn. Joseph said that he just happened to be driving by the young children's home when he noticed Dylan and Shasta playing in their front yard in swimsuits. And that's when he began to survey the residence and make his evil plan. On May 16, 2005, police received an unusual phone call. The call to the police came in from a resident of Kootenai County, Idaho. A man called the police to report a white pickup truck parked on his property. As the dispatcher got more information from the man, he looked inside the car, and what he saw was something incredibly shocking. He saw an axe and a toolbox in the front seat. At first, this discovery was not completely groundbreaking, but later in the day, the dispatcher would get another call from the same man, and this time it was clear that there was something really wrong. On the call, the man said to the dispatcher, referring to the parked truck on his property, "I can't explain it to you." The dispatcher told the man, "Well, they need to know what's going on." Then the man proceeds to tell the dispatcher that the vehicle is fine, but that when he went to pay his neighbor's son for mowing his lawn, he found blood everywhere. The dispatcher tells the man that she'll have someone call the man back. This man was unfortunately the landlord to Brenda and Mark, and their bodies, along with their 13-year-old son, were about to be discovered. Authorities raced through the rain to get to Brenda and Mark's home, and they came upon the family vehicle. More specifically, they noticed what appeared to be bullet holes in the back window. As they approached the home, police noticed several bloodstains around the front door. The police tried knocking on the door, but no one answered. They quickly moved through the house, taking a few dogs into their care as they moved towards an open back door. And they would soon discover why the dogs were so riled up. In the kitchen, one of the officers made a gruesome discovery. They found the body of Slade Groene, 13, with his arms bound and his head wrapped. And in the area between the kitchen and the living room, they found the body of Brenda Groene with her hands zip-tied behind her back. She was face down on the floor. In the living room, the officers found Mark McKenzie, 37, who was also dead. And little did they know the worst was yet to come. What police would soon discover is that Brenda's two youngest children, Dylan and Shasta, were also missing from the house. But at first, investigators thought maybe Brenda and Mark had brought their kids to neighbors and friends' houses. That is, until Dylan and Shasta's biological father, Steve Groene, called the police station desperate for information as to the whereabouts of his two kids. See, Mark was actually the children's stepfather, so when Steve, the kid's biological father, called the police, he sparked the dark investigation into what happened to the two young children. And soon after that, an Amber Alert was finally issued for Dylan and Shasta. Detectives began a desperate search for the two kids in the nearby wooded area near Mark and Brenda's home. Though they hoped to find the kids alive, detectives feared the worst. Investigators went back to the grisly crime scene hoping to find clues, and as they waded through the horrendous mess of blood and debris, they soon discovered how this poor family was slain. When the autopsies of Brenda, Mark, and Slade came back, they determined the cause of death to be blunt trauma to the head. And they also determined that the victims were bound before they were killed. A disgusting and terrible realization to uncover, especially considering one of the victims was just a young child. Detectives tried desperately to find Dylan and Shasta. They treated the situation as a possible abduction by a dangerous predator. The police quickly asked for assistance from the FBI. Over the next few weeks, the search for Dylan and Shasta became national news, and the whole country waited anxiously to get any kind of good news. Even a psychic was used to aid in the search for the two missing children. The cops got several leads, but none yielded any results. They put up signs, ads, and ran the stories on every news station. So, were the children still alive? Or had they met the same fate as their mother? On July 2nd, nearly 2 months later, the investigators finally got the break they so desperately needed, when customers and staff at a Denny's began calling the police to report sightings of Shasta. The first woman who called from Denny's told the dispatcher that a young girl had entered the restaurant that looked just like Shasta. She also said the little girl was with a tall man. The woman kept saying how much the little girl looked like Shasta, and the dispatcher quickly asked if they were still in the building, to which the manager said, "Yeah, they're at table 20. But that wasn't the only call the police got that day. In fact, there was another man who was at the same Denny's who called to report that same little girl. Again, the customer said the little girl looked like Shasta. The dispatcher quickly asked the man if the girl was still inside the restaurant. The man replied, "Yes, she is, and she's with an older man." The man on the phone then says he had shown Shasta's missing child photo to a waitress who also recognized the young girl. The other customers also recognized her, but couldn't believe that Shasta could actually be out in the open with an older man. This caller had a strong sense of urgency, and he insisted that he wanted the police to send down a deputy to look. This older man that Shasta was with would of course be later identified as Joseph Edward Duncan. and this one moment would lead to the unraveling of a lifetime of horrendous crimes. When police officers arrived at the restaurant, they quickly identified Joseph, and it didn't take them long to uncover his lengthy criminal history and find out that he had multiple warrants for his arrest. The dispatcher is heard listing off the multiple crimes that Joseph had committed, and thank goodness his horrible criminal history finally caught up with him. Shasta identified herself to a waitress at the restaurant and to authorities and was quickly rushed to the hospital for medical treatment. At the hospital, Shasta was finally reunited with her father. Meanwhile, police arrested Joseph on kidnapping charges and for his outstanding federal warrant. But unfortunately, there's a horrible piece of this terrible puzzle that is still missing. Where is Dylan? Well, when Shasta was found without Dylan, authorities began to give up any hope that he was still alive. The police continued to ask the public for tips to help locate him, and because Joseph had a number of cars he had stolen, they asked if anyone had seen a specific red Jeep Cherokee that he was driving at the time of his arrest. Meanwhile, about 40 miles east of the gas station, an employee in Kellogg, Idaho recognized that vehicle. She told investigators that the car had stopped at her station hours before Joseph was arrested. This employee said she had thought she recognized Shasta too, but wasn't sure. However, once Shasta was found, the employee and her manager notified authorities after reviewing surveillance and realizing that it was her. Meanwhile, an investigator met with Shasta in the hospital where she recounted the horrible events leading up to her rescue. And it was in this extremely graphic and disturbing account that police would find out what happened to Dylan. Shasta started with the morning that her mother woke her to tell her there was an intruder in their house. Shasta recalls that when she walked into the family living room, she found her family bound and tied. The man who had entered her home, Joseph, she said that she had never seen before that day. After that, Shasta said Joseph removed her and Dylan from the house. They were told to wait on the front lawn. Then Joseph went back inside the house, and Shasta recalls hearing yells and cries from inside. After that, Joseph took Shasta and Dylan and loaded them into a car. He then transferred the two kids into another car, the red Jeep, and drove them out into the wilderness. It was out there that Joseph's most disturbing behavior from this case would be recounted. Shasta recalled that they stayed at various campsites while they were out in the wild. She told detectives that he hit her hard and chained her and Dylan to trees. She also said that he would slip pills into their drinking water. Furthermore, she told investigators that Joseph would make them write letters to their father as a form of torture. At the end of one letter, Shasta wrote, "We might see you again," indicating that Joseph was giving the kids hope of possibly being reunited with their father. At one point, Shasta said that Joseph left her chained to a tree while he took Dylan away for a long time. And when they returned, Dylan was injured. Shasta found out they had gone to an abandoned cabin where Joseph had tortured Dylan for hours. Joseph then showed Shasta a video recording of the torture that he inflicted on Dylan. In the video, Joseph is recorded shouting religious ramblings while he tortured Dylan. But at this time, both Shasta and Dylan were still alive. So what happened to Dylan? Shasta then told investigators about a critical incident that happened with Joseph and Dylan. She said that while Joseph reached inside a container, his shotgun went off and shot Dylan in the stomach. Then Joseph went over to Dylan and shot him in the head while Shasta watched. He then burned Dylan's body at their campsite, and thus detectives switched their search for a missing person to a body. Shasta then revealed to investigators that Joseph nearly killed her days after killing Dylan. She told detectives that he had given her the choice to either be killed by strangulation or with a gun. Terrified, Shasta chose the former. That's when Joseph proceeded to wrap a rope around her neck and tightly pull it. This caused Shasta to start suffocating. However, she was able to summon enough breath to beg Joseph to stop, using his nickname Jet, and by some miracle, he stopped the strangulation. Then Joseph asked Shasta if she wanted to meet his mother, to which Shasta told him yes. That's when Joseph drove Shasta back towards Coeur d'Alene, and it was on this trip that Joseph stopped at the Denny's restaurant where Shasta would finally be rescued. But her account didn't stop there. Then, Shasta revealed something that would help solve several other cold cases over the past decade. She told the detectives that Joseph had admitted to committing several other violent murders. With that information, detectives ended the interview. Investigators quickly got a warrant for the red Jeep, and inside they found a shotgun, zip ties, and many more disturbing items. These items included all the film equipment Joseph used to film himself with Dylan. But where was Dylan's body? 2 days later, on July 4th, 2005, investigators were able to find human remains near a remote makeshift campsite in the Lolo National Forest near St. Regis, Montana. Those remains were sent to the FBI lab for DNA testing, and it didn't take long for them to be positively identified as those of Dylan. On July 16th, the public memorial service was held for Dylan. That day would have been the young boy's 10th birthday. All in all, a horrible tragedy. Meanwhile, in custody, Joseph asked to speak with someone about the murders of Mark, Brenda, and Slade. From these interviews, authorities discovered that Joseph kept an encrypted journal online called The Fifth Nail, which he started in 2004. The title seemed a little odd, but according to lore, in addition to the 4 nails used to pierce the body of Jesus Christ in his crucifixion, there was a 5th nail that was taken away and hidden by the Romans. Joseph used the name for his own website and blog, and on the website, which depicted his day-to-day life as a convicted sex offender, Joseph claimed to have been sexually abused as a child. In this journal, he goes on long diatribes about the justice system and society at large. He even talks about trying to protect children from men like him. But days after writing in his journal, he was torturing and assaulting Dylan. Joseph then went on to tell detectives about his long history of crimes. To give you a little more context, let me tell you about how long that history really was. Joseph's arrest led the FBI to launch a nationwide review of unsolved missing child cases that spanned the 2000s and the 1990s. Joseph was implicated as a suspect in several crimes between 1994 and 1997 when he was on parole. And then again, police looked into crimes between 2000 and 2005 when he was free from prison. And although Joseph was let off as a suspect in some cases, in others he was made a prime suspect. Among those cases was that of young Anthony Michael Martinez. On April 4th, 1997, Anthony was playing with his friends in the front yard of his home in Beaumont, California. That's when an unknown man, Joseph, approached the group asking for help in finding a missing cat. But the boys refused to help. That's when Joseph grabbed Anthony at knife point. He took the young boy and drove away with him in his vehicle, and 2 weeks later, Anthony's body was found nude and partially decomposed in Indio, California. Authorities also discovered that the poor young boy had been sexually assaulted and bound in similar manners as Joseph's other victims. Eventually, this case went cold, until now. But really, this case was reopened to bloggers in July 2005. They noted the similarities between Joseph and the composite sketch in Anthony's case. They also noticed the similarities in Joseph's car and the one in that case. Those 2 key clues led the FBI and National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to get involved in this case. And in turn, Riverside County authorities were able to help match the fingerprint taken from Martinez's body to Joseph. And on August 3, 2005, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department officially announced Joseph's connection to Anthony's case. On July 19, 2005, Joseph confessed to Anthony's murder. He described the crime as revenge against society again for sending him back to jail for a probation violation. But these were not the only murders that Shasta's recount helped solve. Authorities were also able to link Joseph to the murders of Samieho White, 11, and her half-sister Carmen Cubias, 9. Later, Joseph would also confess to beating the 2 young girls to death. Finally, on July 13, 2005, Joseph appeared in a Kootenai County court. There, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping, all in conjunction with the deaths of Brenda and Slade Groene and Mark McKenzie. While the county prosecutors wanted to charge Joseph with the kidnappings of Shasta and Dylan, they could not due to a technicality. Because transporting children across state lines for the purpose of sexual exploitation is a federal offense, Joseph had to be tried in the federal courts, and thus Joseph's lengthy and long overdue time on multiple trials would begin. The first of these trials was set to begin on January 17, 2006, but was delayed until April 4th. This delay was due to the defense asking for more time to prepare for the trial. Again, the trial was delayed to October 26 for the same excuse. The judge justified the decision, saying that no one wants to try this case twice, including me. And Joseph's attorneys blamed the delay on the prosecution wanting to pursue the death penalty. But on October 16, 2006, shortly after jury selection began, Joseph reached a plea bargain. Joseph pleaded guilty to all state charges and was immediately sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the 3 kidnapping charges. But the sentencing on Joseph's 3 murder charges was delayed. The judge said that if Joseph did not receive the death penalty on the federal charges, he would return to Kootenai County for a death penalty phase on the state murder charges. This judge was not messing around and determined to make sure that Joseph was held accountable for his life of crimes. And over 2 years later, after being sentenced to death on federal charges, Kootenai County sentenced Joseph to 3 additional life sentences, and thus ensured he would never be set free again. As part of his sentencing, Joseph also agreed to cooperate with Kootenai County Sheriff's detectives investigating his crimes and provide passwords to encrypted files stored in his computer, which, as you can imagine, contained a horror show of disturbing material, video footage, and journals. On January 18, 2007, Joseph was indicted by a federal grand jury on 10 counts of kidnapping, kidnapping resulting in death, aggravated sexual abuse of a minor, and sexual exploitation of a child resulting in death, and other crimes related to illegal firearm possession and vehicle theft. Joseph was then arraigned the next day at a federal court in Boise. In Boise, the judge ordered that Joseph stand trial the following March, but Joseph's defense attorneys once again immediately requested a postponement. This must have been torture for all the victims' families to constantly be waiting for Joseph's many trial dates. But on December 3, 2007, Joseph pleaded guilty to all 10 charges against him. As a condition of this agreement, Shasta was allowed to not testify in the penalty phase of the trial. Due to a gag order, there were no other details of the plea agreement that were released. But at least Shasta was spared this part of the proceedings. On April 14, 2008, jury selection for the penalty phase of Joseph's federal trial began. During the jury selection, Joseph dismissed his attorneys and chose to represent himself. Wow, that is a twist. Joseph's attorneys objected to this and asserted that Joseph was not competent to take on the job. They also requested a formal hearing about this issue. So the court had to order an evaluation of Joseph to determine his competence to represent himself. And what did they find? Well, this may surprise some, but they concluded that Joseph was competent to proceed without counsel. On August 27, 2008, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty for Joseph. The judge imposed 3 death sentences for kidnapping resulting in death, sexual exploitation of a child resulting in death, and use of a firearm in a violent crime resulting in death. Each of these sentences were related to the torture and subsequent death of Dylan. And on November 3, 2008, Joseph was then sentenced to an additional 3 consecutive life terms without parole in federal prison for kidnapping Shasta Groene and for sexually abusing Shasta and Dylan. In September of 2012, Joseph was finally incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Indiana. And while nothing can bring back the lives lost at his evil hands, at least it's a small piece of justice for Shasta's family. Additionally, earlier on January 18, 2007, the same day Joseph was indicted in federal court, Riverside officials announced that Joseph was charged with Anthony's murder. And on March 15, 2011, Joseph finally pleaded guilty to Anthony's murder. He was then sentenced to 2 more life terms on April 5, 2011. This sentence came without the possibility of parole or right to appeal. Although Joseph could have faced a separate death sentence in addition to the ones he had already been sentenced to in federal court, he did not. Why didn't Anthony's family pursue the death penalty? Well, they just said they wanted closure in the case. In 2016, Shasta Groene, then 19 years old, began a petition called Slade and Dylan's Law. The law was in honor of her 2 brothers that Joseph murdered. In the petition, Shasta stated that convicted sex offenders should not be let out of jail. If this was in place then, Joseph would never have been allowed to harm so many more young lives. And this law would effectively mean that the 3-strike rule for violent sex offenders be reduced to 1 strike. By the time the petition closed, it had 51,820 supporters. Joseph was in prison on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Indiana, and in July 2019, the United States federal government announced that they would be resuming executions after a nearly 2-decade hiatus. Joseph apparently claimed he was relieved to hear this news. Joseph said the execution was better than dying of natural causes in prison, and he even claimed that he was worried that the government would never get around to executing him. Joseph made the assertion that everyone on federal death row would be better off if they were executed. But execution would not be how Joseph died. In October 2020, Joseph underwent brain surgery after he was diagnosed with glioblastoma. He declined any treatment and rejected chemotherapy and radiation therapy. Medical staff at the Federal Bureau of Prisons estimated he had between 6 and 12 months left to live. And thus, he finally died on March 28, 2021 at the age of 58. So what happened to Shasta? Well, according to a 2022 interview with People magazine, Shasta already had 4 sons and was expecting her 5th child. In the interview, Shasta is described as a no-fuss mother who was seen tying back her multicolored braids and shuttling her kids from playdates. At the time, she worked as a supervising housekeeper at a nearby hotel, and in her off time, she shoots digital glam videos. Shasta said about these videos, "It makes me feel great, like all the insecurities are gone. I guess I kind of hide behind makeup." Shasta admitted that she had been hiding on and off for 17 years since the horrible incident happened with her family. And though she survived weeks of terror at the hands of Joseph, her ongoing recovery from that trauma had been difficult. She has implied that although she has physically escaped Joseph, the emotional scars of that incident linger on. Shasta now hopes that by sharing her story, she will help empower other victims of violence and serve as her own catharsis. She added, "You are not your past. Every day is a new chapter." The tragedy of this case is that Joseph was not stopped earlier. It's hard to think about how many crimes could have been stopped if he had just been kept in jail at age 15. And we want to extend our compassion to the families and the victims that were discussed in this case today. That's all I have for you. I'm Allie, and thanks for watching Killer Bites.